Hey everyone, welcome back to our second mini lecture in our series on learning. This time we're continuing our discussion of classical conditioning and talking about some more kind of advanced concepts in conditioning. So first up, let's talk about higher order conditioning, also known as second order conditioning. This is a conditioning procedure in which a previously conditioned stimulus is paired with a novel neutral stimulus, creating a new, often weaker conditioned response. So this is the same thing as standard classical conditioning, but instead of a unconditioned stimulus, we're using a previously conditioned stimulus as our reinforcer. So let's talk about this with an example. So let's say you've got a good friend here, Harold. Harold can be a neutral stimulus in this instance. Harold doesn't make you hungry. Harold doesn't make you salivate. He's just a friend. But let's say you often get pizza with Harold. Pizza is an unconditioned stimulus. It's food. You don't have to learn about it to know that it's a delicious, biologically relevant thing that motivates you. So let's say you pair these things together pretty often. You're always getting out and getting pizza with Harold. Every time you see Harold, he wants to go get pizza, always getting pizza with him. So while the pizza produces the unconditioned response of desire for pizza, salivation, behaviors that you would use to get pizza, pizza in itself will initiate that. Harold does not, right? Not at first. With enough pairing, just seeing your good buddy Harold is going to make you want to get something to eat. You're always eating pizza with Harold, so now you want that pizza whenever you see Harold, right? Your friend becomes a conditioned stimulus, a cue that predicts the occurrence of pizza and prompts you to start your pizza. So as your relationship with this elderly person blossoms, you're getting pizza more and more often, he starts calling you up a little bit. Your phone rings when he calls you. Let's say that for some reason you're one of the people who uses a ringtone, and maybe you even set a custom ringtone for Harold. Now, these things are being paired together. Harold's calling you all the time. Your friend Harold is a conditioned stimulus. You remember, the presence of Harold makes you want to get pizza now. So that's being paired with the ringtone on your phone, right? Harold calls all the time. Your ringtone's a neutral stimulus. Your ringtone doesn't make you hungry. But if we pair it enough, guess what happens, right? Your friend Harold already elicits this conditioned response of desire for pizza. What's going to happen when we pair this ringing phone with Harold? Well, you guessed it, the phone becomes a conditioned stimulus in itself. Now, whenever you hear that phone ringing, you're going to experience the conditioned response of a desire for pizza, right? Because this phone has been associated with Harold, who is associated with pizza. Now the phone is associated with pizza. When that ringtone goes off, you got to have that pizza. Okay, so pretty much everything we've been talking about so far is acquisition, the initial stage of learning and association, right? Pairing of a neutral stimulus with an unconditioned stimulus, right? We pair those things together so the neutral stimulus becomes a conditioned stimulus, right? We can tell that acquisition has occurred when that neutral stimulus becomes a conditioned stimulus. We know it's a conditioned stimulus because it's causing a conditioned response, right? We know the bell became a conditioned stimulus when it started eliciting salivation, a conditioned response. Timing is really important here, especially with animals. Having the neutral stimulus be presented immediately prior to the condition or the unconditioned stimulus is ideal. Right? Things being closely associated in time matters. And the neutral stimulus occurring before the unconditioned stimulus will help this go faster. So you can see here, over time, with repeated pairings, the strength of the conditioned response increases. So it becomes a more and more robust response as learning develops. So the strength of the conditioned response grows with more and more conditioning. But is there a way that we can weaken the conditioned response? Well, that's what extinction does. Extinction is the diminishing of a conditioned response. The way this happens is presentation of the CS alone. So if the food stops appearing after the bell, the conditioned response, salivation, will decrease. You can imagine that if you have a dog that you've conditioned to whenever you ring the bell, the food comes out. You can imagine you ring the bell and the dog is going to come over and start salivating. Then if there's no food, dog will be a little disappointed, right? Let's say you do that again. You ring the bell, dog comes over, no food. Okay. Ring the bell, dog comes over, no food. Over and over and over again. Eventually, the dog is going to learn that that bell no longer predicts food. It's going to stop salivating when it hears the bell, right? There's an important distinction here. Extinction is not the same as forgetting, right? Extinction isn't losing an association, it's learning a new one. So when previously you learned that Bell predicts food, now you're learning Bell predicts no food. And now that new association you've learned can compete for expression with the old association. And that's going to be important in just a second. Spontaneous recovery is the return of that initial association after extinction has taken place. So following extinction, presenting the CS alone might lead to spontaneous recovery. So basically the way this works is we have our initial training, right? The neutral stimulus is paired with the unconditioned stimulus until it becomes a conditioned stimulus. We condition and condition and condition until it becomes very strong. Then extinction takes place. Right? We start presenting the conditioned stimulus alone. We present that bell without any food. And now the salivation, or whatever the conditioned response might be, decreases and decreases and decreases until it's down to basically nothing. With a little bit of time, we see that that initially learned association tends to compete a bit better than our extinction memory. And we see a spontaneous recovery of the conditioned response into presentation of the conditioned stimulus alone. If we continue to present the CS alone, of course, this behavior will rapidly extinguish. Right? So if the CS, the tone, or the bell, or whatever we're talking about, is presented repeatedly without the unconditioned stimulus, the conditioned response will undergo extinction rapidly. Okay, let's talk about generalization and discrimination. This is basically the idea of how selective the memory is. Generalization refers to sort of a broader responding to many things that are similar, and discrimination is sort of a narrowing of responding. So let's say Pavlov conditioned dogs to drool when he approached. Right? They could hear his footsteps and would begin to salivate. But these dogs would also begin to drool when they were hearing any footsteps. Perhaps people walking down the hall or somebody who wasn't normally a feeder, they could hear those footsteps and would begin to drool in response to hearing anyone walking by. That's generalization. This is the tendency to have conditioned responses triggered by related stimuli. In the sense, more things would make you drool, right? More different types of footsteps would cause the same conditioned response. The dog, in this instance, is applying what it knows. Footsteps predict food, and generalizing that to any sort of footstep will predict food. Discrimination is kind of the opposite. Let's say that Pavlov conditioned his dogs to drool only to bells of a certain pitch. Slightly different pitches would not trigger drooling, right? So you might train the dog to learn that only bells of a certain pitch predict food, while others do not. This is discrimination. Only responds to specific stimuli, and this prevents generalization. Less things make you drool, right? Only the specific tone that you're trained on will make you drool, and the others. We can't talk about learning without talking about Watson and little Albert. So Watson is a famous behavioralist that was really in his heyday in the 20s. They conducted a little experiment on an infant where Watson and his colleagues claimed a steel bar every time a rat was presented to Albert. Albert is the little baby here. In this process, conditioning takes place, and Albert learns to be afraid of furry things. Watson's got on record with his pride in his ability to shape people's emotions. He also later went into advertising. So let's look at the elements of conditioning here, right? Before conditioning, we have a little furry rat. Little baby Albert likes little furry white things. So yeah, it's a rat, great. We also have the unconditioned stimulus of a metal bar. Clanging that metal bar is making a loud, scary noise, and baby doesn't like that, right? Albert will cry when you make a loud, scary noise. So what if during conditioning we pair this nice little furry rat with a loud, clanging noise? That's going to produce a fear, a scary response, right? Albert's going to cry in response to this bar being clanged. And if the rat is repeatedly paired with this clanging noise, it's going to acquire a predictive relationship. So now, when our friend little Albert is presented with this furry rat, he starts to cry. He knows that when this furry animal comes out, something bad is about to happen. That loud noise is coming, and he's conditioned to be. But importantly, little Albert generalized. All sorts of white fluffy things made him afraid. He developed a fear of all these little white fluffy things because they are like the thing that predicted the loud noise. So he generalizes and develops a fear response to all sorts of different fuzzy white things. All right, that wraps up our discussion of classical conditioning. Next time we'll be talking about operant